Right, the participant seems to have eased up now, so I think we can get started. Cool. So cybercrime at the moment, I think it's at the highest rate it's ever been at. And contrary to what many people believe, Salesforce isn't immune from these type of threats. So that's why I think webinars like today are so important for people to fully understand how secure their Salesforce instances are, along with where they can improve that security. So my name's Andrew Cook. I'm the Salesforce technical instructor at Salesforce Ben, and I'm also the host of today's webinar. And I'm lucky enough to be joined today with Zak Taylor, Enterprise Account Executive at AutoRABIT, and Daniel Stange, Technical Architect and CTO of Die Interaktiven. I hope I pronounced that right.
Well done.
Yeah, guys, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having us, Andrew, and hello to everyone joining us. Today's webinar is, of course, about how secure your Salesforce org is, and talking about, where are the blind spots? How do we prioritize them? How do we patch them? Quickly introducing ourselves here. My name is Zak Taylor, Enterprise Account Executive at AutoRABIT. I get to work with a lot of enterprise customers, specifically in regulated industries. So think banking, governments, healthcare, insurance. They have much stricter standards when it comes to the data that lives in Salesforce and the processes around it. And we work on securing their pipeline and automating security.
Yeah, and I'm Daniel Stange. I'm a technical architect, and I work as a CTO for an implementation partner in Germany, Die Interaktiven. I'm a Salesforce MVP, and the security topic that we're talking about today is one of the things that fascinated me about the Salesforce platform from the beginning, that I didn't have to worry about security. And over time, I learned that these kind of things don't go automatically, and I'm probably the worst enemy for the security of the org by customizing it and building stuff in it. And that's what we're going to talk about and what you're going to do about it. And I'll pass it back to Zak to guide you a bit through what we're talking about today and what the actual topic will be. Zak, can you give us a brief intro?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for today's agenda, primarily what we want to start with is, where are the risks, right? What are the risks that most folks have to think about when you're getting onto Salesforce, or when you've been on it for a long time? Your company's maybe in mid-implementation, or they implemented years ago, and now you're just trying to get your head around, where do the risks live? The second place is kind of along those lines. Where are the common sources of data leaks that we do see? Some of you guys may have seen the recent Krebs report. Perhaps you have colleagues that have experienced some type of data leak from Salesforce. And where are those actually coming from? Is it just Salesforce issues, or is it more involved with the people and what customizations you put into Salesforce? And then lastly, we'll take a look at how do we address some of these issues. So jumping into understanding the risks, the first thing that I kind of want to do is zoom out a little bit and think about, Salesforce's original intention. And Daniel and I talked a little bit about this, last week, but really Salesforce was created as a CRM, right? And not a development platform. But more and more, we're seeing enterprises and customers of Salesforce, they wanted to do basic CRM functions back in the 90s and early 2000s when it was launched. And as their customers got more complex, they said, hey, we want to move other applications and other processes onto this. So we're going to need to connect it to all of our other important apps and systems across our tech stack. And we're going to want to add these custom layers of code. And Salesforce original architecture was not really designed for that, right? And when that happened, that's where we start to open up our attack surface, right? You look at your Salesforce instance today. If your company has been building on it for even a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you take something that perhaps has some issues with it, but let's just say is relatively secure, Salesforce out of the box. And then you start layering on all of these customizations and all these new areas where data can come out or data can come in, new users can come in, external users can come in. That's really where we start to open things up. As far as the consequences, we don't have to, reiterate this too much, but we all know exactly how costly a data leak can be, or a break in compliance, or some type of regulatory body saying, hey, you violated these rules. I think the average most recently for a company's data breach cost was, I think, around $21 million or something like that. And then for enterprises in the Fortune 1000, that number was even higher than that, in the hundreds of millions. So we know how costly it can be for folks to have a data breach. And obviously, from a brand perspective, customers, just simply lose trust, right? There's compliance failures, regulatory bodies get far more strict with you. That leads to a lot of churn and a lot of work on your end at that company.
Yeah. I think the basic, the thing that we basically have to understand is that a risk doesn't necessarily have to be the risk in form of a hacker or something, but it could be, the basic understanding we should have is that we are operating on a SaaS platform. There is data in there and people whom we grant access to this data. And technically everything, every person and everything that handles these kind of data can also be a risk to that kind of data that you store. So the consideration should be, what do we put in there? Whom do we grant access? And how do we treat the data? And we're going to detail this a bit later in the things to look for. But think in multiple dimensions. It's not just people taking away data from your Salesforce. It could also be an automation that destroys data at large scale because it's misconfigured or something. Also, this is a risk to the data, and incorrect data. I am from a GDPR compliance area, and GDPR also states that data should not only be secure for in terms of exposure to other people, it should be correct. And this, if you store the data, you're responsible for the correctness of the data and the integrity of the data. So if I put Zak's name in there, I should make sure that it stays that way. It is probably the birthday that I store for him, just because I want to give him a present, should be correct. Otherwise, if I change this, this is also a failure in compliance. And these are the things that Zak pointed out, which leads us to your responsibility.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I heard you say it was your responsibility, and I just had to push to that next slide, because this is something that I think a lot of Salesforce customers forget. And it's that you can read your Salesforce contract and it'll say in very black and white, it is your responsibility, data protection. It is your responsibility, the security of your Salesforce instance. Once you take on this application, it is your responsibility. It's your environment. It may be in a SaaS hosted environment, but it is up to you and your team to make sure that your data is protected within there. It is up to you to make sure that any integrations that you use cannot be compromised. It's up to you that any custom code or custom configurations or managed packages that you put in there are also secure. So do not look at Salesforce and be like, it's Salesforce, it's on the App Exchange, therefore it's safe, or anything like that. It's all your responsibility.
Indeed. And and it's good that you highlighted managed packages as well as integrations, because it's not just users that you grant access to, it's also things that you put in that you can't analyze yourself. You can't look into managed packages, what they actually do. If they're security reviewed, there is a high level of trust that you can put in there, but it's not at all safe by nature and forever and under all circumstances. It's just been reviewed by Salesforce under the procedure that was then in place. And another thing, in this place, I kind of contemplated when Zak showed me these slides, about the first bullet point. I thought like, I was in the position that when the guest site user still allowed this, I was doing kind of webhooks with unauthenticated access to catch like a lead response without a kind of web to lead form or so. Looking back at my career, I built these kind of things where I today would say, is that a really good decision? And it's really important that you over time reflect on the decisions that you built, and check, is this really still at the level of the security that you should have today? And for that, you need probably documentation where you put your decisions down and can revisit them after a while. but that's a completely different thing, documenting your
Right.
decisions. But contemplating about these things, I knew at least a handful of orgs where I built things that violated what Zach pointed out here, where I am the threat number one by allowing these kind of things to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the source, folks. So the more people that you have working on your org, whether that's contractors, implementation partners, internal teams, whatever it is, the more people that are involved in the customization and the implementation and management of your Salesforce, that's actually one of the largest sources of risk. Right. So as we get into common sources of Salesforce data leaks, I think I saw a study, I'm forgetting the publication, but I think it was something like 89% of the cyber attacks that are occurring in the marketplace right now, not just Salesforce, but across applications. The source comes down to a person making either an error or compromising something. So it's not like there's going to be some hacker that is just a complete genius that finds a way to code his way into, your system. They're going to exploit the mistakes that people have made. Someone is going to deploy a permission or a profile into a lower environment that it has modifiable access. Somehow they're going to get access to your pipeline. And because that modifiable access is in there and they think your developer thinks it's okay because it's a lower environment, now you have a compromised system, right? It's all comes down to the people. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah. Funny anecdote. I can only second to that, because the most interesting thing that I happen to see in a regulated industry is that I stood in at the reception of a bank where the receptionist was gone, and an employee came by and said, "Where are you headed?" And I said, "I'm going to visit John." John happened to be the person in charge for the security and compliance processes. So this employee took me with him, so I could walk straight to John's desk. And John said, "How did you get here?" And this is the kind of vectors that you have to take into consideration. There are multiple reasons why people have access to all things, and also, and as a side note, sundowning access for users in your org is also a responsibility. You cannot just add them to the org. You have to sundown them. You have to know which kind of access. And that is a responsibility that we have to cover. And these are the most common sources actually for compromising data or putting your data at risk.
Yeah. And I mean, the goal here, folks, is not to place all of the say, oh, all of my employees are bad. They're going to be the reason that I have a compromised data or have a security leak. It's really just to highlight the source of the problems, right? The source of some kind of exposed data is likely to stem from your people, likely to stem from the people working on the customizations. So there has to be layers of automation where those people are being checked by machines with processes that have been defined, right? So automatically checking to make sure there isn't overly permissive settings. This is something that I've been working with a lot of customers recently. We have always done security scanning with folks, and we have a lot of security rules within CodeScan. But a lot of our regulatory customers were coming to us and saying, "Hey, I love the fact that you guys are checking for SOC injections and data exfiltration and all these hardcore, cyber threats. But what about my permission sets and my profiles and my access settings? We are giving those out like candy, and we have no idea how they're impacting things when we hit production. We have no visibility into it." So we actually just built that onto CodeScan last year, and now we have that in most of our regulated customers. But something to manage when you're deploying profiles, permission sets, you're thinking about Apex code customizations. Are you enforcing security rules? What does your field level security settings look like across all of your features? These are things that have to be automatically checked in each environment, or they will inevitably get missed. We've all opened up a profile and had to check 100,000 boxes in order to give out a permission. So it's so prone to human error. There has to be automation there.
And one thing to consider here in terms of permissions, should there be any kind of risk to data? Most of the new data protection regulations like the GDPR or the has a regulation in place that says if there's a breach or if there's any risk to data, you have to inform the data subjects. And this leads to overexposure because you have to describe what has been exposed and which data points of which person. So by allowing a lot of people a lot of access to basically everything, you can containment of a breach or any kind of data loss also meaning defective data that has been corrupted by whatever automation went wild. Describing that loss will inevitably lead to saying, okay, every customer's total set of data has been somehow probably exposed or affected. If you design strategies early to reduce the number of things that could basically be exposed, will help you to have a very small set of data to be affected in case something happens. Mm-hmm. So the overly permissive settings in whatever direction, lots and lots, millions and millions of records, hundreds of fields available to everyone. That is opens up the end that you have to, whenever something happens, you're completely affected in all areas. That's really, when you have this in mind, looking at these things really and investing time on that really makes sense, because it keeps you from writing the letter that at the end to all of your customers, we don't know who has been affected, we don't know what has been leaked. Deal with it. That is the end of a company typically. If you have to write a letter, or if you have looked at the kind of password managers that had breaches, this is the end of a company in that area. If you have to write a letter to everyone, well, we don't know what we've lost, but we lost something.
Yeah.
And overexposed data is basically that unbounded business risk that you have. So we cannot stress this enough.
Yeah, nobody wants to get that email internally or externally. So
oh yes.
that's a big headache for everybody. So yes, overly permissive settings. This one's huge. This one is big, and it's not easy to get checked. Everyone's doing it manually. There's virtually nothing to alert you. So look at automation options here. CodeScan. We just, like I said, we went GA with this last year on an element that will notify you and quality gate anytime there is a profile or permission set that steps outside of compliance in any environment. Now, as we shift into another source, technical debt, really, right? And when we say buggy applications, what we're really talking about is like bad code that creates a vulnerability. For example, field level security issues. Another example being, permissions or access to a certain set of data not being checked in code before it's exported, or not being checked before they're accessing the feature that can access or export that code. Metadata dependencies getting corrupted. These are all things that we see as technical debt. There's a concept that we've been seeing more and more, which is almost like I would call it nested vulnerabilities, where Daniel talked about how, hey, I wrote some code 10 years ago or 8 years ago that looking back may have been a vulnerability or may not have been best practice. And what was best practice 8 years ago may have been fine 8 years ago, and it's in your code base now. But now that you have all these other integrations, now that you have all these other users, now that you have all these other use cases and all this other data, that's not best practice anymore. But that code is still there and it's still what is impacting and running your system. So how do you look back with some type of clarity and not just say, I have a code base of 100,000 lines of code and try to scan through every single line manually? No one's ever going to do that. It's not going to work. How do you scan that in its entirety and identify the technical debts and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, the common tool for that is static analysis. There are various offers, and I know you already dropped the name of your own product, CodeScan, quite a number of times. The interesting bit is you have to really look at these things. I remember very well when I started with Salesforce, there were a lot of code examples in the documentation and help pages that were kind of dubious from the beginning, and every experienced person should have known that. Starting out with Salesforce, I was not experienced at all. So when this thing started like global class so-and-so without sharing, this didn't resonate with me what that actually means. I didn't know about modifiers, and I didn't know about the keywords without sharing. So I just copied the code from whatever the blog I found, or even from the help pages. And it's only it came only over time that Salesforce applied the same rules to their own documented code examples that also apply to the security review. And security review has their own dedicated security scanner that applies the methods of static analysis. And modern static analyzers go well beyond that and kind of try to reconstruct the execution tree to understand the context of problems. And I understand that's something you also already have built in your product, or something comparable built into that product. I could go and ask you questions about the product, but we didn't want to go too deep into that and more educate on the problem. Probably you can elaborate a bit about these kind of nested things and how you can help to identify them.
Definitely. So that's a big one. And I mean, listen, if you guys want to hear all about CodeScan, you can just reach out to me or head to our website. Happy to, give you access to that, run the scan and everything like that. But in the interest of educating you guys on again, where are some of the most common sources and how do we start addressing them? Third-party integrations is the next place where I would start thinking about your vulnerabilities. Is managed packages, like we called out earlier, integrations, and I mean, Daniel even mentioned it, right? If you are copying code from a blog, that kind of falls a little bit into the static code analysis. But I mean, every developer that I've ever worked with is in a good way, lazy by nature, right? If I don't have to code, 1,000 lines and I can find 700 of those lines online or through ChatGPT, I'm going to use that, right? I don't want to spend all of that time coding if I could just copy it. So the same thing is true for these third-party integrations and managed packages. Why would I build an entire system to do something that I could simply pull from the App Exchange, maybe pay some money, and I'm going to be able to do it that way? The thing here is, I think with managed packages, you have to remember that these are locked and the code is not yours. So you could have the most secure Salesforce instance in the world as far as your customizations go. But once you take this locked managed package and put it onto your instance, you are now vulnerable to the same things that it is vulnerable to. I have run many scans for many Salesforce instances, and there have been a lot of instances where we find vulnerabilities in a managed package that the customer is unable to change because it's a locked managed package. But you are still, again, responsible for the data in your system, the integrity of your system, and those integrations impact that. So you really need to be vetting those thoroughly.
Yeah. Adding on to that, if you run into support issues, you can share or and request support from the vendor of the managed package. You can share the logs or access to the logs through your to your vendor, and compromising information in the log files, either that you create or that the managed package creates, is one big source of exfiltration of data from the org. Because sloppy programmers typically leave debug statements in the logs and throw information that they see in the process to the logs, and you don't know how logging and how debugging. Typically, managed packages don't debug data from the processes, but you still don't know, and you don't know once you start sharing logs, you still don't know what exactly these logs will share to your vendor. So whenever you do this, you are running a risk of compromising stuff. And the thing that Zak didn't have here as third-party thing very explicitly is that there are a number of packages that are not managed packages, so didn't go through the security review process, That also and the risks and the attack vectors are even bigger there, because if you install whatever package that has not gone through the security review, there's just one warning in Salesforce at the moment, and you can confirm that you know the risk and understand the risk. Make sure that you do if you click that thing, because once you install that, you have that package in your org, and some packages open up access to the org itself. Some packages request you to add remote site settings, or tell you that they are going to install remote site settings, so that you allow communication between your org and the vendor side. Make sure you understand the impact and that this complies to your policies and regulations.
Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely right. So be really aware of what you're putting into your system. I think it's very easy to look at some things and just pass it off to InfoSec. And oftentimes I've found InfoSec doesn't really have the best handle on what's going on in Salesforce. They're really familiar with their servers. They're really familiar with other applications, but they really don't know much about Salesforce. So it's really on you as the developer or the architect or whatever to manage that.
And what if there is no InfoSec department, really? So there are a lot of solo admins, smaller companies that don't even have a fully fledged IT department that contains an InfoSec department, and so on and so on. So we don't want to scare you, but the responsibility still lies with you, and consideration and probably writing down what led you to do this and that will later on save you in terms of what could happen, and in case if something happens, document what has been decided and why.
Yeah. So let's show you guys the light here. No more of the vulnerabilities and the fear, right? How do we address the issues? How do we solve this problem? First things first, prioritize the proper settings. Okay.
Exactly.
The number one thing that is a big no-no is giving out the modify all access or giving out just expansive default settings to anyone and everyone, because it makes life easy, right? Of course, it's easy to do everything in Salesforce if you have modify all access, but that's how you start to get these risks, because somebody has the ability to modify, to delete, to export, to change everything in your system. That type of user, if a bad actor were to get control of that would be absolutely devastating. Or if that user were to just accidentally change something. Can't tell you how many times I've had groups that accidentally have deleted something or accidentally have modified something that they didn't want to, and they have no way of rolling back or no way of recovering, right? So it's huge.
Yeah. Again, the one of my early days example, I was running a lot of things. I knew I could do data corrections if I just ran an anonymous Apex from the developer console. These are kind of patterns that bring avoidable mistakes to your org. Simply treat your production org as the holy grail that you even don't allow yourself to as the guardian of that org to go beyond the rules that you set up for others. There's a massive risk, and again, what you pointed out, the changing data, deleting data, corrupting data, basically is another big threat, and one of the most important ones. When it comes to the impact could be that you're addressing your customers the wrong way, and they are going to ask questions like, why is it that way? So avoid a step away from doing these kind of things in production straight. And proper settings also include respect, for example, the crackdown that Salesforce made on the guest site users for good reasons, because that is the unauthenticated and the authorized unauthenticated access to your data and your org. Opening up to the guest site user basically means exposing data to the world, and that is a risk that you should know and have under control when you're tampering that user's permissions. One thing to know probably is that if you're using an external sharing model, and I think we're coming to this as well, the default for new orgs is private. but the orgs that have existed before the before an external sharing model will simply copy over the internal sharing model first, or for time being, for a while, copied over the internal sharing model, and that left you with a extremely huge attack vector on your data. So in particular with community cloud, you should be very restrictive in the baseline settings, and then open up, as Salesforce has very little chances to deny access to data later on.
Yes, and that is a really good example that, you know, if you guys want to read something in an actual vulnerability that's been exploited very recently, look up the Krebs community of vulnerability that was recently released, right? So all you got to do is Google Krebs community users Salesforce breach, and they identified, I think it was, you know, a number of companies, but they had 3 examples from 3 different industries. They had a healthcare company, they had a government agency, and then they had a financial institution who all had this same type of vulnerability. And it had to do with exactly what Daniel was just talking about, community users. They had a community site, and an external user was able to go through this community site and just gain access to everything. And it wasn't because the code was bad. It was just because, again, too much access was being given in this feature, and therefore anyone and everyone was able to get on there and take out any data from the entire Salesforce system. So
it's a basic way of how things can work for external access. So it's technically, even as Zak said, is most of the if you don't configure do the settings correct, and correct is basically setting in a good baseline by avoiding the overall expansive things. It's very simple. Public read or public read write are expensive because they basically mean you can access everything if you do that.
Yeah. One final point I want to make here, Daniel, is this second bullet point, automated scans of profile and permission settings. This is something that, again, we were being asked for a lot from our clients, because there's only 2 options for this in Salesforce. If you want to monitor your profiles and permission settings, and you want to monitor what access is being given out in your orgs, you have 2 options. You can either monitor it manually. There is no way to get notifications for these things. Salesforce is not going to notify you. And I just want to emphasize the complexity of this, because these are all layered on top of each other. It's not like a profile is just always going to win out, and as long as your profiles are good, you're fine. No, this is combining profiles and permission sets. One profile might have like one user might have a profile and then 2 permission sets that give them essentially modify all access, because they had this one which has A, B, and C, and this one has X, Y, and Z. And when you put those together, it gives you modify all access. And then they get to a feature with, you know, no security rules enforced. It's not something that you can easily decipher. So having something automated that's telling you, hey, what was just deployed to QA is going to take the entire org out of compliance and these 17 users into a modify all state. You need something automated. Yeah, jumping in, you want to kick this one off, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm going just away from the bullet points, because the most important change that Salesforce made recently should be called out here. We have the pattern integration often typically runs on users, because you need to assign a license and credentials to an integration. And in the past, as user licenses are costly, we often had an overly permissive profile assigned to one user, and this user has been used for all integrations. And this is basically a nightmare to everything that Zak has put on the slide here, because it opens up all these, violates all the things that go into that slide. If you're on that side, the first thing that you want to do before you even start following the bullet points is see how many integrations you have and how you could segregate them by assigning, by creating users with the new integration user license. assign an API access only restrictive profile that is typically, and that's something, a pattern that Salesforce does really well. If you start doing the profile for the integration, it starts with minimum access, and you actively have to open it up, and it covers most of the things, and then you can follow the bullets here, which is basically low-hanging fruit, but you really have to understand and go into that, because integrations by nature carry data from your org to other systems, or bring data from other systems into your org that manipulate the data that you have in your org. And manipulate could also mean corrupt data. And then we are back to data security basics.
Yes, it's absolutely right. I know we're running a little late on time here, so I'm going to jump to the next slide. Last but not least, this is when it comes to protecting your Salesforce instance. We called out some of the most common places that you're going to see vulnerabilities. The people are a big part. The more people working on your org, the more customizations that are coming into your org. Those are two really big areas. Permission sets, profiles, your access settings, your field level security settings in the code. Those are really some of your biggest areas. How do we actually address those? You've really got to get some automation in place to be checking these things. There's too many boxes to check, too many places where things can change, that if there's no automation in place, you're bound to have things come through. It's just inevitable. On top of that, adhere to your best practices, right? Everything we've got on screen, this is nothing super new, but you got to know that you've got to have encryption in place. Got to have some type of training on passwords and phishing. I think, again, that article I read, 89% of cyber attacks are coming from a people compromisation. The biggest category there was phishing. So it's very easy to be like, hey, I'm your boss, I need your password right now, or something like that, work on premises if possible. This is one where, if your company is wanting to keep things within their own firewalls, we have a lot of regulated industries who want that. This is something that, if you can manage it, is one way to stay very secure. Automated DevSecOps tools goes right back to the automation. Got to be able to roll back, got to be able to back up your data, back up your metadata, and restore quickly so that you're not losing money when your Salesforce is not working.
One thing to keep in mind about encryption, if you're using the Salesforce default tool or the add-on licenses in Shield, decryption has already been done when the user is looking at things. So it doesn't help you to address all the threats. It helps you to address only one specific threat. That is for the data at risk and the data at transfer, but not once it has. But for most purposes, including API access, the data has already been decrypted before they go out to either the user or the API. And in terms of data backups, the thing to remember, and that is really something, data and metadata backups, by the way, companies typically do metadata backups by storing their complete org in a bit repo. A backup procedure is worth nothing without a recovery procedure. So you need to try and practice to restore data from the backups that you made. Same goes for restoring your metadata. The whole routine is a waste of time if you don't practice and establish routines to restore data. That has to be practiced. A dump of your org, either data or metadata, is worthless until you know how to recover from that. And that is awfully tedious, except when you have proper tooling for that. And that is an investment in most of the cases. I'm not betting for any specific product. Most of the products are in this area are pretty expensive because they not just do the backup, but also the recovery routine. And the recovery routine is where the honey is.
Yeah, Daniel, I think that's a really important point. And I know we didn't even talk about backup and recovery that deeply when we met previously, but AutoRABIT does do backup and recovery, but we have so many customers that come to us that had something, I'm not going to drop a bunch of names here of other competitors, but there's a lot of companies out there that can do backup, and it's very easy to do backup. It's very easy to take the data or to take your metadata or take XML and put it in storage somewhere. What's difficult is restoring the dependencies of Salesforce. How do we take that big web of metadata where everything is interconnected? Your changes from 2018 are somehow connected in this web to changes you made yesterday. And how do you then decipher that entire web? And if you just want to do a partial restore, take the components that are all connected and restore just those components. Or if you need to do a full restore, keep everything intact without triggering all kinds of workflows and all kinds of things that are going to alert your customers. That is where the difficult part is. And that's why, Salesforce specific tooling, like our backup and recovery, for example, is really important. You shouldn't have a problem backing up. What you'll have a problem with is restoring. And that's why, Daniel and I both recommend get specific tooling for it. All right. I think we've got about 15 for questions. So yeah, Andrew, do we have questions on here?
Let me just quickly jump in because I had a question that was raised one-to-one on me. Regarding Shield and encryption, yes, the question is, do I agree that this is basically for data at rest to make that was a mix-up or a mashup of risk and rest, data at rest. Indeed, yeah, it adds a layer of encryption on the data that you have in Salesforce specifically at rest with some. I say that again, right? At rest, which allows you to bring even the key for the encryption. It will protect your data better from actors that have already access to the technical location of the data. So it's not not helpful for users that have access to data because to Salesforce, because then the data will be presented decrypted. Encrypted fields in some ways allow you to protect data a bit, but as far as I know, the encrypted field that you have in Salesforce is not encrypted well enough so that it's PCI compliant. So it doesn't help to have an encrypted text field, as far as I know. I think, Zak, you're better in terms of regulated industries, but I think the standard encrypted field doesn't offer the right protection so that you could store a credit card number PCI compliant in that.
I believe you're right on that one. We brush up with PCI. We're PCI DSS compliant, and we definitely work with a lot of folks who need that. The encryption side, I don't work on the encryption as much, so I'm not 100% certain on that one.
Yeah. So a technical question about how code scanning generally works. The basic static analysis generally works in a way that you have have XPath rules, so a kind of a way to read into the metadata and analyze what's in there, and then you look for patterns in there. That's the very basic and the baseline that the most famous static analysis tool, PMD, and its offspring Apex PMD does. And most commercial tools, AutoRABIT as well, what they do is build a bigger context of the potential execution around this thing. Probably, Zak, you can explain something about CodeScan and how it exceeds the typical things, because that's the second part of the question. How does CodeScan and AutoRABIT's CodeScan do this kind of analysis?
Yeah, so to give, it looks like we got about 3 questions around that. So as far as how CodeScan works is you're going to either run the scan by connecting to a Salesforce org. That could be your production environment, your UAT, QA, sandbox, whatever you want it to be. We're going to use the metadata API to pull all of the code, right? So all of your Salesforce code, whether that's Apex, Lightning Web Components, Aura components, your profile and permission sets, we're scanning those as well. Essentially, any code all the way down to the XML that is involved in your Salesforce, we're going to pull that, and we're going to run, like Daniel said, we're going to use a long library of rules. We've got about 240 or so for Apex, and then I think about 90 or 100 for LWC, and then we're covering like JavaScript, HTML, and then we've added new rules for profiles and permission sets. So we're taking your entire code base, and then we're going to run that baseline scan. So we're going to take all that code and run it against all of our rules. That's going to give you a baseline that says, here is your technical debt. Here's the vulnerabilities that we've identified based on the code you've given us. And then, let's say you actually have the product. When you run your next deployment or your commit or merge request, it's going to run CodeScan as a quality gate there that says, hey, based on the quality gates that you've set up, based on the standards that you have, you're about to add a vulnerability to your QA or to your production. So we're going to block this deployment, and it's not going to move forward. And it's able to just look at the delta when you do that deployment because you've run the baseline scan. Couple other questions on how we're getting we're using the metadata API. Yes, we're using the files, so we're going all the way down to the XML there. And yes, we scan metadata. Does it work with both production and sandbox environments? Sorry, scroll down. Or just production? Nope, we work with all Salesforce environments. So production, sandbox environments. Most folks will actually have the scanning set up for multiple. So they'll have one scan that's running on production every time there's a deployment, one scan running on UAT, scan running on QA. It's really meant to be a continuous thing. So I think one thing when it comes to static code analysis, as far as how it should be applied, whether it's CodeScan or something else, it should not be a one-time exercise. Okay, static code analysis is not something where you just scan production and you're like, okay, we scanned production, great, we're good. We found our issues and we're just gonna remedy those. It's a continuous process because you're continually deploying new code. If you're deploying code every 2 weeks or every month or every week, then you need to be scanning that code as it comes in. Otherwise, you're just going to keep building a mountain of technical debt. So that is where you really have to think about integrating whatever static code analysis tool. Of course, I'm going to recommend CodeScan, and so will the rest of the market, right? But you're going to have to put that into your CI jobs, and you're going to have to tie that into either your Jenkins pipeline, your AutoRABIT pipeline, your Capado, your Flowsum, whatever you're using, even if it's just chain sets or version control. Profiles, permission sets, insecure permissions. Okay.
So one thing, another question that I got was is pretty interesting, and the answer is obviously quite unsatisfying, but it points at a good point. That's why I wanted to call it out. The question is, do we know anything that can prevent the assignment of field level security based on the data classification? And even though I don't know any tool that does this, question goes over to you, Zach, probably if that's already in CodeScan, or if you want to have it in CodeScan, probably at a point in time. The data classification fields are great to demarcate what the intended purpose of a field is and what's in there, and that's something I highly recommend doing, even though it's massively tedious for each field to decide, is there personal identifiable information in there? Under which kind of regulation is it considered as being this and that, or is it confidential? Is it company confidential? It's not just about privacy regulations, it's also about company secrets and confidential stuff, and really maintain that data classification. And then you can query that, by the way, so you can do this, people can use a query against this field to find out what kind of fields do they have that have this information. And should a tool do this in the future automatically, or if it's already in CodeScan, I don't know. Do you have it at hand? Or if you ever get asked about that, it's important to have it at hand.
No, that's a really big one, and obviously, I'll call out that, I mean, we've been doing a report on the top vulnerabilities we found across all of our scans for the past 3 years, and you guessed it, the #1 issue by far is always field level security issues. So to answer in short, we do address field level security issues by having a number of rules associated with those specifically and settings around those. But if you have very specific, hey, this is what I want to happen with my field level securities in every instance that meets this criteria, you can customize those rules in CodeScan so that you feel comfortable with your quality gate. Meaning, and that's where the automatic enforcement comes in. Again, you probably don't have any bad actors among your admins or your developers that are just deliberately trying to give out access to things. It's just they code something and it works and they move it forward. You need to have something automating enforcement that says you need this field level security setting in there, or else this is not going to be deployed.
There's one question about what tool you're using for scanning profiles, permission sets for insecure permissions. Until I met Zak, I didn't have an answer to that. So I pinged that to you because that's something you were already promoting. And the second question that probably goes directly with that is, do you just point out insecure settings or vulnerabilities, or can you also provide point to solutions to that?
Yeah, great. So I'll kind of answer both questions in one here. Yeah, the profiles and permission sets, CodeScan is actually the only folks who can do that. We have the only product that can do that. So if you guys know of another one, let me know, because I'd love to know. But as far as I know, we're the only ones. For the suggestion of solutions, CodeScan actually will give you, here's why this is an issue, and here is a way you can fix it. It's not going to tell you, here's the code. It's not going to give you that, right? But it is going to say, here is an example of what the fix should be. We have a lot of customers that are at like a more enterprise scale. They have like anywhere from like 10 to 300, 400, 500 developers on Salesforce, and they have a lot of junior developers that are writing code for the first time. Maybe admins transitioned into developers for Salesforce, and they need help identifying, how do I fix this code? How do I make it better if they're going to be told this is a vulnerability? So we have a lot of people using CodeScan as a training tool, actually, where you have an IDE plugin that's live in your IDE and will tell you, hey, this is an issue. Here's what this is going to be an issue when you run the scan or when you try to deploy. So here's how you can fix it right now.
Another question was, is there a way to update all the external sharing settings to put it into private in bulk? I can give a nerdy explanation. If you do have a checkbox in CodeScan to set all external sharing to private, here goes the chance for an elevator pitch.
I don't think so. That's you. That's all you.
The easiest let's phrase it. If you have the command line tools, Salesforce DX command line at your hands, you can pull all custom objects and do copy and replace. For the project, VS Code can do this. Replace the external sharing in all of the files in a specific path, the objects folder, for example, and bring the external sharing model to private in default. That's the way I can do this, or would do this. Look for the external sharing where it's public read write or public read, and then replace by I think it's external sharing bracket element read write or private, and you can simply replace all of that and deploy again. That would fix the problem, but it requires some understanding of the command line or good handling of the VS Code IDE, and also some understanding of XML and the way metadata works. If you do that to have it, then it's easy. Just retrieve all your custom objects, copy and replace the values.
Well, I believe, is that all? We have one more? Doing a health check scan in Salesforce. Okay. Daniel, you seeing this one more question here?
That's yeah. Dennis asking for and specific asking for Copado compliance hub. It has
No,
to be
on the Q&A one. It says when doing a health check for Salesforce.
When doing a health check scan in Salesforce. Yeah, that's the optimizer report.
I'm not certain.
Yeah, can you be probably whoever raised that question? Could you say if you're referring to the optimizer report, or if that's a specific security center feature? It says that that Salesforce flags in a health check scan in Salesforce that public view is flagged as a critical security issue.
Application security.
The interesting thing is it's a bit tough, because if you expose data, the question goes at if that's critical, how can you expose these things to a community? You can do that, can expose things with public external sharing model. But you should consider what you expose, and it needs your attention, and it really needs human brains. If there are, if the object doesn't hold any data that would be considered a risk. I mean, what is it that you're sharing? Consider you're putting your wallet on the street. What's in there? What is a risk for you, or what is a danger for you, or problem for you if it's in your wallet on the street, available for everyone? There could be coins. Coins have some value, but they have low value if stolen. There could be your credit card that has a high value if stolen, because you could withdraw money and buy whatever you want until you lock the card. But there could also be things like guitar picks. A guitar pick has no value for you, no value for the attacker. There could be personal photos, which would be a loss for you, but have no value for an attacker. So all of these kinds of, and this also goes for the data that you expose publicly. So you have to classify the data that you have in that object, and if it was available on the internet, if that poses a risk to you or not. Would it harm your company? Would it harm a person if this data was available publicly? And from there you can take it and make your considerations how to protect these kind of data. Other formula fields that are pulling sensitive data from other objects onto that publicly available object. That could be one thing. You could share it publicly, but or you could make it private and open it up by a sharing set as an easy way of reducing that. Or you could layer on top a restriction rule so that you limit the access of publicly available data as in a scope with the things, with the kind of things that, for example, the unauthenticated guest site user or the authenticated user brings. So you could restriction rules allow you to lock down a part of the publicly available stuff depending on the user who views that. So you can even though it's flagged as a potential vulnerability, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a vulnerability, but it highlights this as a threat just because there could be a threat be inside that. You have to make sense out of that by understanding what kind of data you expose and what can be done with that. Is that a threat for your company? Is that a threat for persons or not?
Yeah. Well, I know we are just at time, and I appreciate those those of you who are hanging around here for our nerd out at the end, but appreciate everyone jumping on. Andrew, thanks for having us. Daniel, it was awesome hosting with you. And if you guys have any questions about anything, you've got us on LinkedIn, and I got a lot of CodeScan questions, so feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or email, or hit us through the website.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Awesome. Thanks all.